My name is Anthony Calder. Until the summer of 1997, I was just a traveling photographer, hopping from town to town, capturing the abandoned, the forgotten, and the quietly decaying places left behind by progress. Then I came to Caldwell, a small town with more fog than daylight, thick woods that seemed to crowd the streets, and townsfolk who looked away when you asked too many questions. It was a place caught between the past and something else, a place that lived in the spaces no one was brave enough to venture. What lured me there was a tip about an old, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. Word was it had been left to rot for over 50 years, dating back to when a tuberculosis epidemic swept through, filling every corner of that place with death and the desperate. The tip-off came from a local historian I'd met at a cafe a few towns over. He'd warned me to stay away, a warning that, naturally, only stoked my curiosity. The only place to stay was the Caldwell Inn, an ancient, creaky relic run by a woman who seemed as weathered as the building itself. Mrs. Howe didn't speak much when I first checked in, only handed me a tarnished brass key and looked me over with a strange, intense stare that lingered too long. It wasn't until later that evening, when I asked her about the hospital, that she spoke in full sentences. Her eyes sharpened and the lines on her face deepened, her lips pursing as she warned me about the doctor who still haunted those dark corridors. "He's still there, Mr. Calder," she'd said, her voice low, as though fearing someone might overhear. "Living like a shadow on the wall, waiting for someone to look in the wrong corner." I waved off her warning, chalking it up to local legend. Every town with a forgotten building had its ghost story, and I'd heard more than a few in my travels. The kind of stories people clung to out of fear, or maybe out of some strange affection for the dark things they claimed to fear. But by the time I made my way up to my room, I felt unsettled. The inn was old, built in the late 1800s, and my room smelled of age, musty and faintly metallic, as though someone had bled against the walls years ago and no amount of paint could cover it up. I lay in bed that night listening to the creaks and groans of the building, every small noise twisting into something sinister in my imagination. The shadows seemed thicker here, darker, lingering in the corners as though alive. Morning didn't bring any comfort. The sky was a heavy slate grey, thick clouds pressing down on the town, and the air felt dense, as though something was holding its breath. I set out for the hospital, driving through winding roads that grew narrower and more choked with weeds the further I went. Trees crowded the path on either side, their twisted branches arching over me like a canopy. It felt as though I was being funneled towards something, pulled forward by an unseen force. Finally, I reached the gates of the Caldwell Sanatorium, looming in front of me like a fortress built to contain something monstrous. The building was massive, sprawling across acres, its dark stone walls draped with ivy and moss. Windows were shattered, doors hung crooked, and the faint scent of rot and damp earth clung to the air. This place was a ruin, a remnant of a time when people believed in keeping the sick hidden away, as though shameful. I crossed through the rusted gate, the silence swallowing the sound of my footsteps. As I approached the front doors, I noticed faint markings on the stones, deep scratches that could have been from weather or something else. It felt like the building was alive, somehow aware of my presence. I pushed the heavy doors open, the metal hinges shrieking like a wounded animal. Inside, the air was colder, thick with the smell of mold and something else, something acrid, a smell I couldn't place but instinctively recoiled from. I took out my camera, snapping photos of the entryway, capturing the long shadows cast by my flashlight, the peeling wallpaper that seemed to curl back like flesh peeling from bone. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional drip of water from somewhere deeper within. I began to move through the hospital, exploring the old corridors. Each room I passed seemed steeped in the memories of suffering, the air heavy with the whispers of patients long gone. I imagined their final breaths, the terror in their eyes as they realized this place was more prison than hospital. But it wasn't until I reached the second floor that I started to feel a presence, something subtle, a change in the atmosphere, like walking into a room where someone has just been speaking about you. My skin prickled, and I felt a strange sense of being watched, though each glance over my shoulder showed nothing but empty halls and dark rooms. Then I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere nearby. They echoed down the corridor, getting closer, growing louder. I held my breath, my heart hammering as I strained to listen. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, that the eerie silence was playing tricks on me. But the footsteps continued, steady, relentless, each step sending a cold shiver up my spine. I ducked into a nearby room, pressing myself against the wall as the footsteps approached. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything but the sound of those slow, dragging steps. I dared a glance around the doorframe and saw a figure moving down the corridor, a tall man in a long, white coat stained with something dark. His movements were unnatural, jerky, as though he'd forgotten how to walk, his limbs moving in stiff, twitching motions. The man stopped, his head snapping to the side as though he'd heard something. Even from down the hall, I could see his face was too pale, his skin stretched tight over bone, with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. But he was looking, somehow I felt his gaze as a weight pressing down on my chest. I held my breath, frozen in place as he took another step, his head tilting as though listening for any sound I might make. After a long, tense moment, he continued down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the distance. I waited until the silence returned, then slipped out of the room and hurried down a different corridor, moving as quietly as I could. But every step I took seemed amplified in the oppressive stillness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still somewhere nearby, watching, waiting. I found myself in a stairwell leading down to the basement, where the air grew colder, damp and thick. Despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I descended, my flashlight casting an eerie glow on the cracked walls and narrow steps. When I reached the bottom, I found a set of double doors, their surfaces marred by deep scratches and what looked like stains, too dark to be rust. Pushing the doors open, I stepped into what appeared to be an old operating theater. The smell was overpowering, a mix of mildew and something far worse, something that reminded me faintly of decay. The room was mostly empty, save for an operating table in the center, gleaming under a light that shouldn't have been working. Instruments lay on a tray beside it, perfectly arranged as though waiting for the next patient. And then I saw him, standing in the corner, watching me. It was the doctor, his figure somehow more twisted in the dim light, his coat stained and torn, his fingers long and bony, ending in nails that looked sharp enough to cut through flesh. He tilted his head, those hollow eyes seeming to bore into me, seeing everything, stripping away every defense I had. "Are you here for treatment?" he asked, his voice scraping across the silence like a rusty blade. The sound of it was wrong, distorted, as though his throat had forgotten how to form words. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My feet felt rooted to the spot as he took a step forward, his limbs bending in unnatural angles, his face contorting in a parody of a smile. I stumbled back, my breath catching as I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing as I fled through the darkened corridors, the walls seeming to close in on me. I could hear him following, his steps slow but relentless, dragging something heavy behind him. By the time I reached the lobby, I was nearly choking on my own breath, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I burst through the doors and into the night air, the mist wrapping around me as I staggered toward my car. When I looked back, he was there, standing in the doorway, his head tilted to the side, watching me with that dark, empty gaze. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from Coldwell, the terror still thrumming in my veins, the doctor's face burned into my mind. Even now, I can still feel him watching me, can still hear those footsteps in the quiet moments, slow and steady, as though he's waiting for me to slip back into the shadows where he waits. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it, the faint, unmistakable sound of dragging footsteps just outside my door.